From Tehran to Blackwater, the real story. How did 444 days in Tehran create America's private army? Most people think the Iran hostage crisis ended in 1981. It didn't. It went corporate. Here's what actually happened. A failed rescue burned into Washington's risk calculus. Insurers panicked, corporations outsourced protection, and US doctrine quietly shifted. There's one decision that rewired policy and birthed modern private military companies. Remember this number, 1986. Everything pivots there. Once you see the chain reaction from embassies to boardrooms to battlefields, the post-9/11 contractor surge makes sense. To understand the machine we use today, we have to walk back to the moment it jammed, and why the fear of being trapped on camera still drives decisions. Tehran, 1979. Shock, humiliation, and a new vulnerability. On November 4, 1979, the US Embassy in Tehran went from a diplomatic post to a lever. Students loyal to the revolution breached the compound, but this wasn't a simple mob. It was a pressure instrument emerging inside a state still forming itself. The Revolutionary Guard, early, fragmented, and hungry for legitimacy, learned a fast lesson. Hostages move politics. Iran's new power centers discovered that televised humiliation could outmuscle formal negotiation. Here's where it gets interesting. The United States had tools, sanctions, covert channels, military threats, but each came with a massive downside. Invade, risk a wider war that could trigger the Soviets and ignite the Persian Gulf. Strike, you still needed granular intelligence and a path out. Wait, every day on the clock reinforced a perception of impotence. Oil markets were already rattled from the revolution. A misstep could spike prices and punish allies. Strategic freedom existed on paper, but operationally, Washington was boxed in. At home, the crisis became a nightly ritual. The countdown on TV hardened public opinion. It wasn't just 52 Americans in peril, it was a narrative of American power stuck in neutral. Politically, that's lethal. The White House carried the burden alone, and each failed backchannel made the administration look smaller. That atmosphere seeds policy changes long after the flag comes down. The lesson forming under the surface: never get trapped on camera again, because once the audience sees helplessness, it rewires trust faster than any policy speech. Now, follow the money. Corporations with people and assets across the Middle East hit the same wall. Overnight, their risk models broke. Insurers hiked war risk premiums, underwriters carved exclusions for civil unrest and state collapse, and many firms discovered their evacuation plans were aspirational at best. Some companies couldn't extract staff safely, others got jammed by airspace closures and host nation pressure. Boards started asking questions legal teams couldn't answer. Who's responsible if we leave people exposed? What's the price of waiting for the Marines? Insurance markets respond to patterns, not speeches. After Tehran, underwriters demanded better risk controls before they'd even quote coverage. That pressure nudged companies towards standardized security planning and outsourced crisis response. You can trace the early normalization of Kidnap and Ransom coverage to this era. Policies that paired indemnity with specialist negotiators and private security consultants. The message from Lloyd's and the syndicates was blunt: professionalize or pay. Meanwhile, the intelligence picture went dark. The revolution torched established networks. Humans shrank. Technical collection couldn't replace local sources who understood the factions, the clerical power brokers, and the street. Analysts overestimated state coherence and underestimated the utility of semi-official actors. Most people think satellites see everything, but they don't see intentions. They don't map who can mobilize 300 students in 2 hours. That blindness compounded operational hesitation. Inside the national security apparatus, you felt a new kind of pressure. Traditional force packages were too visible, covert options were too thin, diplomatic leverage eroded by the day. Every scenario gaming the embassy ended with one problem: extraction. Getting in was hard. Getting out was where missions died. And once the hostages were dispersed, the risk of mass casualties soared. Tehran had the leverage of geography and tempo. Washington had the burden of transparency. There's another layer: The crisis taught hard lessons about sovereignty optics. Even if you could assemble a strike package, a failed incursion would validate revolutionary propaganda and trigger reprisals across the region. US facilities worldwide became potential hostage targets. Ambassadors and regional commanders began thinking in concentric rings: compound security, movement protocols, evacuation triggers, and the need for assets that could be surged without headlines. Corporate security officers quietly mirrored that logic. They started building hardened site plans, layered access, and vetted local guards, but they needed expertise quicker than they could hire it. Outsourcing wasn't about bravado, it was about timelines. Training programs, standard operating procedures, hostile environment briefings, these became line items. The private market began to assemble capabilities the state couldn't deploy openly. Once you understand the tension, public constraints, private exposure, you see why a deniable layer became attractive. Not mercenaries in the movie sense, but structured firms with insurance backing, legal wrappers, and a service catalog that fit neatly into risk spreadsheets. This was the seedbed. Tehran provided the shock, and markets supplied the incentives. Pressure builds, then Washington tries a risky solution that rewrites the playbook. The hostage clock kept ticking, and the White House authorized a mission that had to be flawless on the first try, over long distances, with forces that had never been integrated for this kind of operation. It was complex, fragile, and unforgiving, and when it broke in the desert, the consequences wouldn't stop at the crash site. They'd reshape command structures, budgets, and the appetite for deniable help, because humiliation on broadcast becomes policy in the bloodstream. Operation Eagle Claw, failure that redefined risk. Here's what actually happens when a country tries to fix a humiliation with a miracle mission. You start by building a unit that didn't exist. Delta Force, purpose-built for hostage rescue, still proving itself. Then you stitch together the Air Force, Marines, Navy, and Army into a one-night symphony across hostile airspace. The plan called for C-130s, RH-53D Sea Stallions, a C-130 Overwatch, forward fuel bladders, and a rendezvous at a featureless patch of Iranian desert called Desert One. It looked audacious on a whiteboard and brittle in the real world. The architecture hinged on tight timing and perfect interoperability. Helicopters launched from a carrier in the Arabian Sea, flying low to avoid radar, through Shamal winds and blinding dust. Transport aircraft came from a different direction. Everyone met in darkness, refueled, then pushed toward Tehran to hit an improvised hide site, stage again, and assault the embassy at dawn. Layers on layers. The problem, every layer added a new failure point. Most people think special ops thrive on complexity. In truth, complexity kills margins. The first cracks were mechanical and environmental. Sand ingestion choked engines and degraded avionics. Maintenance crews had limited time and minimal spares staged forward. One helicopter turned back with a cracked rotor blade. Another got lost. Others arrived late. You can plan redundancy, but once platforms start dropping, the plan begins to cannibalize itself. By the time the package assembled at Desert One, the count was below the minimum required to execute. That transformed a high-risk mission into a near-impossible one. Command and control were equally fragile. Authorities were split across services and departments. Communications were cluttered, intermittent, and not standardized. Weather reports underestimated the density and persistence of dust. Terrain assessments were thin. The entire plan assumed that units with different cultures, checklists, and tolerances could perform like a single organism on night one. That's not jointness. That's wishful thinking born from urgency. Then the catastrophe. During refueling with visibility low and tempers up, a helicopter collided with a C-130. The fireball lit the desert. 8 Americans died. The mission aborted. There was no fallback story, no clean exit, no graceful failure. Wreckage and bodies remained, later broadcast by Tehran. Instead of a rescue, the world saw confusion, flames, and retreat. It validated Iranian narratives and deepened US self-doubt. And inside the Pentagon, it became a case study in how not to run special operations, and how a single televised failure can paralyze options for years. Now, this is important because the failure didn't just embarrass a White House, it exposed systemic faults. Logistics fragility wasn't a footnote, it was the headline. You can't expect precision from aircraft that have never trained together under the exact conditions they'll face. You can't command from a distance through stovepipes and hope the edges align. You can't build a complex plan around assets you don't control end-to-end and call it deniable when it's obviously national. The political fallout cut both ways. On one hand, skepticism of special ops surged. Critics called it cowboy planning and amateur execution. On the other, the appetite for options that didn't risk a primetime disaster grew. Here's the paradox. Eagle Claw made policymakers want elite capability and at the same time made them allergic to public failure. That's the seed of deniability math. If uniformed missions carry catastrophic visibility risk, you start asking what can be done by people who aren't wearing the flag. Inside the community, lessons hardened into reforms. Training had to be joint, not ad hoc. Dedicated lift, standardized comms, shared rehearsals, and a command structure that could own the full mission profile. These weren't luxuries, they were preconditions. Aviation support for special mission units needed bespoke doctrine and gear that could handle brownout, long legs, and hot refuels. Weather and terrain intelligence needed to be fused into planning from day one, not patched in at the end. But here's where it gets interesting. While the uniformed side began pushing toward reforms that would become law in 1986, the market was already moving. Corporations read Eagle Claw as a message. Extraction is fragile, visibility is deadly, speed is everything. If the state couldn't guarantee a clean save, companies had to build their own layers, secure compounds, vetted movements, private air options, and crisis consultants on retainer. Underwriters quietly began privileging clients who could show credible private security plans. That's how a crash in the desert becomes a line in a policy. Eagle Claw also shifted how the intelligence world framed risk. Over-reliance on tech without humans in the city was a recipe for surprises. The dispersal of hostages across Tehran changed the geometry of any assault. You needed eyes in apartments, garages, and safe houses, local texture that satellites don't provide. That insight later justified quiet partnerships with private entities that could embed, survey, and prepare the battle space without triggering diplomatic alarms. The final impact was cultural. After Eagle Claw, commanders understood that a failed rescue doesn't just lose lives, it changes strategy. It can derail presidencies, distort budgets, and push decision-makers toward low-visibility tools. So when the next crises came, the question wasn't only, can we do it? It was, if we fail, who pays the price on camera? When you can't afford a public failure again, you start looking off the books. The Reagan reset, from retrenchment to retaliation. Most people think the story resets when the hostages come home. It actually resets when Washington decides humiliation won't be the lasting image. January 1981 arrives, and the posture flips. Restore credibility fast, punish when necessary, and widen the toolkit so the White House isn't cornered again. Publicly, that looked like tougher rhetoric and targeted shows of force. Quietly, it meant more latitude for covert action and a new way of thinking about risk. Spread it, hide it, and make sure options exist before the next crisis lands. Here's what actually changes. The executive branch clarifies boundaries for intelligence operations under Executive Order 12,333. No assassinations. Yes to intelligence collection and certain covert support with findings. Congress expects formal covert action, findings, that tie the president to activities while keeping details behind closed doors. Inside the Pentagon and Langley, planners start playing with the seam between Title 10 and Title 50, uniformed military authorities versus intelligence authorities. Title 10 is overt, accountable through the chain of command. Title 50 allows covert action once the president signs a finding and Congress is notified. The seam becomes useful because it lets you engineer operations that are legal, deniable, and flexible. That seam will later accommodate contractors who can move between support and operations without putting a brigade on the nightly news. Then Beirut happens, and the lesson hits with shrapnel. In 1983, the US Embassy is bombed. Months later, the Marine barracks are hit, killing 241 American service members. Force protection goes from checklist to doctrine. Embassies aren't just symbols, they're targets that shape strategy. The State Department's Diplomatic Security Service expands, but it can't field armed protection everywhere at once. The military tightens perimeter security, hardens compounds, and codifies movement protocols. But everything changes when you realize you need layers. Local forces, Marines or Seabees for hardening, intelligence coverage, and an outer ring that can flex fast. That outer ring becomes a space where private firms, vetted and insured, can scale on demand. Now, this is important because while the government adapts, corporations are reading the same threat picture. Oil majors, shipping lines, engineering firms, anyone with personnel in volatile zones, see the embassy as their weather vane. If the US mission is hardened and mobility gets restricted, their risk rises. Boards ask for armed drivers, safe housing, crisis plans, and extraction options that don't depend on the next carrier group. Insurance underwriters start writing conditions into policies. Prove your security plan or pay more. Kidnap and ransom policies normalize with 24/7 response teams and negotiators. The demand signal spikes for professional, insured security that can operate in the gray advisory today, protective tomorrow. Aviation if things break bad. Inside the military, 2 lessons crystallize. First, you need elite reach that can be assembled, commanded, and supported as a coherent system, not a one-night pickup team. That insight will drive joint reforms later. Second, you need deniable security layers that live outside the uniformed footprint, not because the military can't do the job, but because politics punishes visible failure and overexposure. If the mission is presence, protection, and persistence, not open combat, then a mix of SOF, intelligence enablers, and contractors becomes attractive. It's not romantic, it's arithmetic. Fewer uniforms on camera, more capacity on call. The legal scaffolding widens the lanes. Covert findings authorize support to foreign partners, training, logistics, equipment, so long as it nests under policy. Title 10 forces can train host nation units. Title 50 channels can run sensitive liaison and intelligence support. Contractors slot into both worlds as technical specialists, trainers, aviation crews, and protective personnel. Their status matters. They're not combatants, but they can be armed under rules tied to the contract and host nation law. That flexibility is the feature. If you need bodies in a bad place without a flag raising, you contract. But here's where it gets interesting. The appetite for retaliation, measured, targeted, preferably deniable, creates procurement demand. Agencies seek surge capacity without long-term billets or political battles over end strength. Indefinite delivery contracts appear. Cost-plus structures reduce vendor risk and reward speed. If a crisis pops in West Beirut or Basra, the government can task a pre-cleared firm with vetted people and insurance already in place. That's the skeleton of a market that didn't exist before Tehran lit the fuse. Lebanon also drives a mindset shift at state. The Bureau of Diplomatic Security expands its worldwide protective services concept in embryo, mixed local guards, third country nationals, and a smaller cadre of Americans to stretch presence and keep embassies open under higher threat. The idea isn't to militarize diplomacy. It's to stop closing posts every time car bombs move the needle. Private security fills the manpower gap while uniformed Marines focus on access control and last-ditch defense. Again, layers. Meanwhile, covert latitude isn't a blank check. Congress exerts oversight. Scandals like Iran-Contra will flare later and recalibrate the lines. But the baseline holds. The president wants options, and options require infrastructure, legal, financial, and human. The contractor ecosystem grows alongside special operations capacity. One trains partner forces where uniformed presence is sensitive. The other builds the unit culture, logistics, and command that Eagle Claw lacked. Demand without supply doesn't move history, the money pipeline does. As budgets flow toward low-visibility tools, firms that can document standards, pass background checks, and ensure their people become institutional partners. And once that pipeline is open, it doesn't close when the crisis cools. It looks efficient, it spreads risk, and it keeps Washington from being trapped on camera again. Insurance, Lloyd's, and the birth of the hostile environment market. Follow the money and you'll see the shift happen in real time. After 1979, underwriters in London looked at Tehran, then at Beirut, and recalculated. War risk premiums didn't just rise, they split. Policies carved out exclusions for insurrection, terrorism, and civil commotion, pushing clients to buy add-ons that didn't exist at scale before. If you wanted coverage in a place like Tehran, you needed a separate instrument that priced political violence differently from storms and fires. That's how the hostile environment market starts, through the fine print. Kidnap and ransom coverage, once niche and discreet, became normal for multinationals with staff in the Middle East, Latin America, and parts of Africa. But K&R wasn't only a checkbook. Underwriters paired it with crisis response providers, negotiators, security advisors, medical evacuation planners, because payouts without prevention invite losses. Lloyd's syndicates began asking basic questions most firms couldn't answer in 1979. Do you brief travelers? Do you vet drivers? Do you have a rally point and a comms plan? The clients who said yes got better terms. The ones who couldn't prove it paid, or they walked away uninsured. Now, this is important because insurance quietly sets standards faster than governments do. Underwriters wrote warranties into policies, maintain a secure residence, implement movement protocols, conduct hostile environment training for key staff. Breach the warranty and your claim is at risk. That created a new cottage industry, trainers, auditors, and security consultants who could build a compliance package that satisfied Lloyd's. The training wasn't window dressing. It covered route planning, surveillance detection, kidnap survival, trauma care, and low-profile behavior. A corporate travel policy turned into a mini doctrine. Boards felt the pressure. Directors heard from legal counsel about duty of care and foreseeability if the risk is known. And after Tehran, it was, then failing to mitigate it isn't just bad optics, it's potential liability. CFOs realized there were only two rational paths: build an in-house security department with global reach, or buy the capability as a service. Building took years, salaries, clearances, and relationships. Outsourcing could start next quarter with pre-qualified personnel, regional experience, and a claims history insurance trusts. Financial incentives aligned toward the contractor. Underwriters didn't just police clients, they curated vendors. Some policies named approved crisis responders. Others offered premium discounts if you retained a recognized firm on a long-term contract. That pushed the market toward professionalization. Firms needed documented SOPs, vetted rosters, training records, and incident logs. A cowboy with a rifle couldn't pass an audit, but a company with a medical director, an ops room, and a 24/7 line could. The language evolved. Protective security, journey management, asset hardening, extraction planning. It fit neatly into spreadsheets and risk committees. You probably think this was just oil majors and banks. It spread wider. News organizations, NGOs, engineering consortia, and shipping firms all faced similar pressures once war risk and K&R premiums signaled that environments had changed. Maritime insurers built political violence riders for ports and anchorages. Energy insurers priced sabotage and terrorism differently from mechanical failure. Each rider nudged clients to demonstrate credible security. If you could show layered protection, local guards, vetted supervisors, armored transport, trained expats, your premium curve bent down. The feedback loop rewarded competence. Here's where it gets interesting. As insurers normalized these requirements, governments took notes. Diplomatic security began codifying standards for compounds and movement that mirrored what underwriters were already rewarding: standoff distance, blast film, access control, and armored mobility. When state later scaled worldwide protective services contracts, bidders already spoke the same language because insurance had taught the market to speak it. The private sector's compliance culture became the government's procurement baseline. Another lever was speed. After a bombing or a coup, clients needed immediate cover or endorsements updated in hours, not weeks. Brokers in London and Houston built war rooms to move endorsements and activate responders. That operational tempo favored firms with global rosters and aviation options, charter links, rotary access, and medical evacuation ties. Insurance essentially underwrote a private readiness network, paid monthly through premiums and retainers, primed to deploy without diplomatic friction. And the economics mattered. Cost-plus government contracts would come later, but the corporate math arrived first. It was cheaper to outsource protection than to carry permanent headcount, training pipelines, and global liability. Outsourcing shifted risk onto a contractor's balance sheet and insurance stack. Claims, arbitration, non-disclosure, corporate law absorbed incidents that might have become headlines if uniforms were involved. That's not conspiracy. That's how liability transfers work. Capital opens the door. Now governments step in with law. As Congress restructured command and funding for special operations in the mid-1980s, it did so into a world where insurers had already professionalized the gray space. The result was a ready-made partner ecosystem. Standards, training, audits, and surge capacity, all priced and proven. 1986, the Goldwater-Nichols and SOCOM pivot. Everything changes when Congress decides to fix what the desert exposed. Goldwater-Nichols in 1986 sounds bureaucratic, but it's the hinge that turns special operations from a pickup game into an integrated machine. The law forces jointness, clear chains of command, empowered combatant commanders, and fewer service fiefdoms, so the next Eagle Claw isn't run by committees. It pushes planning authority down to theater commanders and tightens the wiring between strategy and execution. Here's what actually happens under the hood. Before 1986, services guarded their toys and their budgets. After 1986, they're required to train together, certify together, and fight as a single organism. Officers have to earn joint billets for promotion. Plans now assume interoperable comms, common procedures, and rehearsals across branches. For special operations, that's oxygen. You can't fly Navy helos, land Air Force transports, and run an Army assault if everyone is speaking a different language. But there's a second move people miss: money. In 1987, Congress creates U.S. Special Operations Command, USSOCOM, with its own budget authority and acquisition lanes. That's huge. It means SOF can buy the aircraft, radios, night vision, and precision gear they need without begging the big services for leftovers. Dedicated rotary wing assets for long-range infiltration, special mission aircraft with terrain-following radars, standardized comms that cut through the fog. This is the kit you buy when you remember the dust cloud at Desert One and vow not to see it again. Now, this is important because capability without command is theater, and command without capability is paperwork. SOCOM brings both. It gives a four-star the mandate to organize, train, and equip a global network: SEALs, Rangers, Green Berets, Air Commandos, Special Mission Units, under one roof. It stands up component commands like AFSOC, NSW, USASOC, and MASOC later, each tuned to a slice of the mission set. The result is predictable execution under unpredictable conditions. Joint Doctrine evolves in lockstep. The emphasis shifts to low-visibility presence, partner enablement, and rapid crisis response. Everything is built around speed to theater, quiet insertion, and resilience when plans flex. Indigenous partnership becomes a core line. Train host nation units, build their logistics, embed liaison, and keep U.S. footprints smaller. That's not altruism, it's strategy shaped by politics. You want effects without battalions on camera, so you grow precise tools that scale just enough. Here's where it gets interesting. As uniformed special ops harden, a parallel contractor ecosystem grows in the gaps. SOCOM still can't be everywhere at once, and it shouldn't be. Title 10 forces stay focused on missions only the military can do. Everything adjacent: base security in tough posts, convoy movement for diplomats, aircraft maintenance in austere fields, signals support, linguists, instruction teams, becomes ripe for contracting. Goldwater-Nichols and SOCOM don't invent PMCs, but they make the interfaces clean. Contracts specify training standards, comms protocols, and support expectations that mirror joint doctrine. If you want to work beside SOF, you've got to speak SOF. The deniability calculus matures at the same time. With SOCOM, the US can act fast and quietly, but visible failures still carry a political tax. Contractors offer a buffer. If a protective detail gets hit on a bad road, the headlines and legal exposure are different than if a platoon takes the same hit. That doesn't erase responsibility. It refracts it through contracts, insurance, and host nation law. Policymakers understand the math. Use uniforms for decisive action. Use contractors to extend presence, protect movement, and keep embassies operating under fire. Funding mechanisms lock this in. SOCOM's acquisition authority pulls specialized kit rapidly. Parallel government contracting vehicles, IDIQs, task orders, contingency clauses. Let agencies bolt on contractor capacity in days. You can award a task order for static security, then spin a surge for aviation lift, then add ISR support, all under a master vehicle. That agility is a direct answer to the hostage clock problem of 1979. Never wait months to build an option. Training and standards tighten across the board. Joint readiness centers bake in inter-service rehearsals. Special ops aviation drills, brownout landings, and hot refuels. Communications kits align with common crypto and frequency plans. Contractors piggyback on this ecosystem. Their pre-deployment courses mirror embassy movement drills, convoy SOPs, and medical standards like TCCC. Insurers love it because it reduces loss. Commanders love it because it reduces friction at the contact point. There's a cultural shift too. Goldwater-Nichols teaches officers to think beyond service identity. SOCOM teaches them to think in networks. That mindset naturally accepts blended teams, SOF elements with intel collectors, aviation detachments, and contracted specialists forming a single problem-solving unit. It's not clean on a slide, but it works in a city you can't pronounce at dawn when a route closes and a principal still needs to move. Critics warned about mission creep, and they weren't wrong to worry. A stronger SOCOM risks being asked to fix everything. The guardrail becomes prioritization and authorities, what falls under Title 10, what slides under Title 50, what belongs to state, and what gets outsourced. In practice, the boundaries hold because the mission profiles differ. Assault and reconnaissance remain sovereign tasks. Protective mobility, logistics tail, site hardening, and training at scale often don't. With the skeleton built, the muscle comes from capability and cover. SOCOM gives Washington fast, precise options. The contractor ecosystem gives it endurance and deniability. Together, they solve the Tehran problem the way policymakers prefer. More tools, fewer traps, and layers that spread risk before the cameras ever show up. Executive outcomes to Blackwater, the PMC model matured. Now the supply shows up. The early 1990s produced field-tested examples that prove a private force can change outcomes. Executive outcomes in Angola and Sierra Leone runs lean, disciplined operations with X, South African Special Forces, using air support, mobility and training to flip battlefields faster than UN peacekeeping cycles. Sandline follows with a more political, consultancy-forward approach, contracts, arms brokering adjacencies, and legal controversy. Whether you applaud or criticize, they demonstrate something governments notice. Small, professional, contracted teams can deliver decisive effects without a national flag at half-mast. But here, where the US context diverges. America doesn't outsource combat the way EO briefly did. It builds a layered contractor market around training, logistics, aviation support, police development, and protective security. MPRI, stacked with retired generals, wins influential training contracts in the Balkans, turning doctrine and institutional reform into exportable services. Vinal trains the Saudi National Guard under long-standing agreements, showing the comfort level some partners have with US-linked private trainers. DynCorp grows deep roots in aviation logistics, police mentoring, and field support. operating where embassy needs and stabilization missions overlap. This isn't rogue warfare. It's bureaucratized capability that fits inside Title 10 and State Department lanes. Then Blackwater. It starts as a range complex in North Carolina, founded by a former SEAL who sees a training shortfall and a business opening. Pre-9/11, it's a niche provider, maritime security ideas, specialized shooting courses, a brand aimed at elite clientele. Post-9/11, demand explodes. State needs protective security details with high-end driving, marksmanship, and convoy skills. CIA needs quiet logistics and low-profile movement. SOCOM and other elements need surge training, ranges, and specialized aviation. Blackwater scales fast because its culture understands speed, standards, and the customer's tolerance for risk. Look at the capability stack that matures across the sector. Static security at compounds is only the anchor. The crown jewel is PSD, protective security details that can plan routes, run counter-surveillance, drive armored platforms at high speed, fight through complex ambushes, and extract principals under fire. Aviation becomes a force multiplier. Light attack and lift aircraft for austere runways, rotary assets for movements when roads are IED alleys. Intelligence support grows from map reading to full fusion, open source sweeps, local atmospherics, pattern analysis, and liaison networks that inform where to drive at 90. Logistics rounds it out. Fuel, maintenance, armoring, comms, and medical capability down to TCCC-trained medics and CASEVAC links. Most people think these firms just sell guns on seats. In reality, they sell readiness under contract. IDIQ vehicles let agencies task them today for Baghdad and tomorrow for Lagos. Cost Plus gives speed and flexibility while shifting some execution risk to the vendor. Time and materials pays for surge bodies and kit when tempo spikes. Contingency clauses allow expansion without a new appropriations fight. It's a business model built for volatility. Pre-vetted rosters, deployable operations rooms, global insurance, and legal teams to keep the machine compliant. Insurance shapes behavior here too. Underwriters reward firms that document training hours, weapon quals, driving certifications, medical drills, and incident reporting. Claims history becomes currency. Companies build internal academies, certify to recognize standards, and keep meticulous logs because premiums and bid scores depend on it. That creates a professional flaw. Are there outliers? Yes. But the center of gravity moves toward documented competence because the market punishes improvisation. Here's a micro-story that shows the shift. A multinational moves into a high-threat oil corridor. 10 years earlier, they'd hire local guards and hope for the best. Now, their broker says premiums drop 18% if they retain a top-tier contractor with armored mobility, vetted drivers, trauma kits, and a 24/7 ops room. They sign a retainer. When a strike turns violent, the team reroutes senior engineers by air, keeps convoys off a flagged choke point, and files documented incident reports the insurer accepts without dispute. That's operational continuity monetized. Blackwater's post-9/11 surge becomes the headline because it sits at the intersection of states' worldwide protective services demand and a war zone that makes movement lethal. Convoys with armored SUVs, chase vehicles, and gun trucks become standard. Critics seize on posture and rules of force. Supporters point to saved principles and completed missions. Meanwhile, other firms, Triple Canopy, Aegis, Olive Group, guard a world's later acquisitions, scale similar capability stacks. Aviation boutiques plug in. Intel shops offer embedded analysts. Logistics firms keep the parts and fuel flowing. The sector looks less like cowboys, more like a supply chain. Profit mechanics drive choices. Cost Plus can incentivize bloat if oversight is lax. Firm fixed price pushes efficiency but risks corner cutting. Good contracting officers weaponize performance metrics, on-time movements, incident rates, medical outcomes, training compliance, to keep incentives aligned. Vetting pipelines pull from former SOF, infantry, MPs, and law enforcement. Pay scales segment the market. Top-tier details recruit high-end talent with rotation cycles and insurance. Lower-cost bids often rely on third-country nationals for static posts, supervised by smaller American cadres. It's a hierarchy that maps cleanly onto risk and optics. Now, connect this back to 1979. Tehran taught Washington to keep embassies open under duress and avoid hostage optics. That demands mobility, hardening, and deniable capacity. PMCs mature precisely in that pocket. They protect diplomats outside the wire, train partner forces quietly, and absorb part of the visibility and some of the casualties that would otherwise land squarely on uniformed units. It's not an accident, it's policy by procurement. One more layer, integration. By the early 2000s, blended teams are normal. A SOF element runs a raid while contractor air moves cargo and fuel to a forward strip. A state PSD escorts an ambassador while an intel-supported analyst cell flags a threat node the locals missed. Radios interop, medevac chains are pre-briefed, and insurance papers are in the glove box. The seams still show, but the machine works because everyone has trained to a common baseline born from Goldwater-Nichols, hardened by insurers, and validated on bad roads. But none of this scales without the next crisis that flips the switch. Demand surges when a war requires presence with fewer uniforms on camera, and the template forged from EO to Blackwater is ready to fill the gap overnight. From Tehran to Baghdad, how 1979 shaped 2003. You probably think the bridge from 1979 to 2003 is just terrorism and technology. It's actually risk and optics. Tehran taught Washington one brutal lesson. Visible failure costs more than strategic patience. That lesson sat in the bloodstream through the 80s and 90s, then collided with 9/11. The result wasn't only war, it was a procurement and posture choice. Massive outsourcing to keep the mission moving while limiting what the public saw in uniform. Start with the through line. In 1979, a hostage standoff made the United States allergic to being trapped on camera. In 1980, a failed rescue clarified how fragile, complex, overt missions could be. By the early 2000s, those instincts had hardened into a playbook: expand special operations for decisive tasks, and pad the gaps with contractors for protection, logistics, training, intel support, and aviation. When Afghanistan opened the gate and Iraq widened it, the state didn't have to invent anything. The market was already built. Now, this is important because Iraq was two wars at once: a conventional toppling of a regime and a long, grinding protective mobility problem. The first part needed armor and divisions. The second needed vehicles, drivers, gunners, radios, medics, analysts, and aircraft to move civilians who couldn't pause the state. Contractors filled the second war so the first war's optics stayed cleaner. If a convoy took contact en route Irish with a principal in the back, it wasn't a platoon's fight. It was a PSD team's job with different headlines and legal wrappers. Visibility mattered. Military casualties land with a political thud. Contractor casualties are reported differently, tracked separately, and often processed through insurance and NDAs. That doesn't make them disposable. It makes them a buffer. The White House could surge presence without putting another brigade on the scroll. State could reopen a ministry or push governance mentors out to a province because a private motorcade with air on call could thread a route the infantry wasn't tasked to secure daily. The psychology is blunt. If the public doesn't see uniforms, tolerance for risk stretches further and longer. The State Department's dependency got deep fast. Pre-9/11, Marines guarded doors. Post-invasion Iraq demanded full-spectrum movement. Ambassadors, POLADs, USAID, rule of law teams, oil advisors, none could sit still. Worldwide protective services contracts expanded from static posts to complex movements. Advanced teams mapping traffic patterns, counter-surveillance on hotel lobbies, sniper overwatch for arrivals, medics rehearsed for TCCC, pilots ready to bypass choke points. The embassy transformed into a hub where contractor ops rooms ran manifests, radios, and air tasking alongside government watch floors. Rules of force and legal shields had to evolve on contact. Most people think contractors are unbound. In reality, they're bound differently. Use of force policies sit inside contracts, synchronized with country-specific orders and US law. Status of forces agreements didn't always cover them. Jurisdiction fell into gray zones where host nation law, US federal statutes, and MEJA extensions overlapped imperfectly. That ambiguity created friction on the street. Tactical decisions under stress could later become strategic problems in courtrooms and parliaments. But the ambiguity also enabled speed. If the mission was move today or lose influence, the contractor model made today possible. Operationally, Iraq blurred lines by necessity. Shared battle spaces meant SOF hitting a target at 0200 could pass through the same district a state PSD would drive at 1000. Intel fused across lanes. An agency cell might flag an IED workshop that a contractor route team needed to avoid by noon. Radios had to talk. Medevac chains had to accept non-military casualties. Deconfliction boards had to track convoy call signs that weren't unit identifiers. Everything changes when a war becomes a grid of overlapping permissions. There's a micro-story that captures the machine. A provincial reconstruction team needs to inspect a power substation. The route's red on the morning threat board. The military can't surge a company to escort. A contractor ops room scrubs SIGACTs, shifts to a wings and wheels plan. 2 armored SUVs run the principal. A third country National Guard force holds the outer ring at the site, and a chartered rotary asset loiters as a contingency. An embedded analyst calls a pattern change near an intersection. The convoy offsets, takes a longer loop, and makes the meet. No one outside the wire sees a battalion. The mission completes, and the insurer notes a mitigated risk event in its file. But here's the paradox Tehran created. If contractors absorb visibility and casualties, the political threshold to act can drop. That's a feature to policymakers who fear paralysis, and a bug to strategists who worry about long wars sustained by invisible logistics. In Iraq, dependency grew. Ministries leaned on private movements to function. Agencies leaned on contractor intel for atmospherics. The military leaned on contract aviation and maintenance to keep tempo. Efficiency today became inertia tomorrow. Adversaries adapted. Insurgents targeted convoys that looked less armored, used lawfare narratives to paint private teams as illegitimate, and exploited row differences. IED economies matured because every road move, military or contracted, could be taxed with risk. Deniability cut both ways. The United States diffused responsibility, militants diffused identity. Tie it back to 1979. The embassy remained the center of gravity, only now it was a fortress dependent on a private circulatory system. Tehran taught Washington to avoid hostage optics. Baghdad operationalized the fix at scale. The blend, SOF for the hard hit, contractors for the daily grind, wasn't improvisation. It was the logical end of a choice made after a flag came down and a camera stayed on. Fortress embassies, from open diplomacy to hardened compounds. Everything changes when an embassy stops being a living room and becomes a target set. In April 1983, a truck bomb hit the US Embassy in Beirut, killing scores and shattering the idea that diplomatic plates and a flag deter attackers. 6 months later, the Marine barracks bombing turned force protection into a strategic variable. The takeaway was brutal. Open compounds invite catastrophe. Soft perimeters write enemy playbooks. From that day, embassies weren't just workplaces. They were defended positions in contested cities. Now, this is important because the response wasn't cosmetic. The State Department commissioned a hard rethink, culminating in the Inman Report. Out came standards that sound architectural but are really survival math. Site setbacks to keep blast waves off walls, standoff zones that swallow vehicle bombs, controlled access with serpentine approaches, laminated glass and blast-resistant construction, limited lines of sight, secure cores, and layered rings from the street to the chancery. It wasn't about building bunkers. It was about buying seconds and distance when the worst happened. Setback became sacred. If you can't move the road, you move the embassy, or rebuild it behind a perimeter that forces attackers to lose energy before impact. Gatehouses were redesigned to act like pressure valves, Vehicle barriers went from telescoping poles to engineered wedges, and guard towers gained elevation and fields of fire that mattered. Interior layouts shifted too. Safe havens with redundant comms, protected power, and overpressure for chemical events. The result looked less like traditional diplomacy and more like mission continuity under attack. The human layer adjusted in parallel. The Marine Security Guard program stayed focused on access control and last-ditch defense of classified material. But the manpower problem was clear. You couldn't post Marines at every portal worldwide and still do diplomacy. That pushed the model toward a mix: local guards for outer rings, third country nationals for static positions, and US or allied contractors for supervision and mobile protection. What became the Worldwide Protective Services approached scaled presence without uniforming every door. Movement security doctrine evolved fastest because the threat migrated from gates to roads. Protective security details built routes using intelligence, pattern avoidance, and time-distance tricks. Convoys added lead and trail vehicles, counter-assault teams, and embedded medics with TCCC kits. Radios standardized. Armored SUVs and buses became rolling safe rooms. Air assets, helos, and fixed-wing shuttles cut risk when roads went red, with landing zones integrated into compound designs. The embassy compound wasn't just hardened, it was a hub for protected mobility. This had a price tag. Hardening costs billions across a global footprint, and every new standard rippled through budgets. Thicker walls, wider plots, specialized glass, hostile vehicle mitigation, secure fiber routes, redundant power. Contractors made the costs scalable. With IDIQs and task orders, state could surge guard forces during elections, dial up PSD during high-threat seasons, and maintain aviation options without owning fleets. The alternative, permanent uniformed manning at that scale, wasn't politically or fiscally feasible. Insurance nudged these choices. Underwriters rewarded posts that met or exceeded Inman-derived standards. Standoff, blast film, vehicle screening, trained personnel, and tested response plans. Premiums bent down when SOPs were audited, drills logged, and incidents reported with credible corrective actions. That feedback loop turned best practice into baseline. Embassies that could demonstrate layered security and disciplined movement earned operational flexibility. Those that couldn't paid in money or lost options. Critics said this walled diplomacy off from the street and alienated publics. There's truth there. A fortress changes the feel of engagement. But here's the counterweight: shutting posts after every attack cedes ground. The hardened model kept embassies open in cities where proximity equaled vulnerability. The art became creating safe channels for real contact. American centers outside the wire controlled outreach venues, secure shuttles, while accepting that the Chancery itself had to survive first contact. Operationally, private security sat in the middle. Local guards brought numbers and local knowledge. Third country nationals offered reliability with fewer political entanglements. US-cleared contractor supervisors delivered training, compliance, and integration with US comms and medical protocols. That mix allowed embassies to keep tempo when threat levels spiked. PSD teams rehearsed route switches, casualty drills, and air-ground handoffs. Watch floors fused incident data, open-source signals, and liaison inputs into movement calls every morning. Everything changes when you treat an embassy like a system. The walls buy time, the gates force choices, the guards deter and detect, the PSDs move the mission, the air bridge cheats distance, the med chain turns survivable hits into saved lives, and the contracting mechanisms make it all elastic, expand, contract, retask, without triggering a headline about troop deployments. Security hardened, but the law kept pace in a quieter way. The more embassies became defended networks, the more rules, authorities, and accountability frameworks had to adapt to match the people actually holding the line outside the flag. The legal grey, AUMFs, MEJA, and the shadow of accountability. Now the rules bend. After 9/11, Congress passes authorizations for use of military force. open-ended authorities aimed at named enemies and associated forces. Here, that's what actually happens. AUMFs create persistent operational theaters without formal declarations of war. Uniformed units operate under clear row, but the ecosystem around them, intel support, logistics, protection, pulls in contractors who ride the authorities as enablers. They're not combatants, yet their missions exist only because the AUMFs opened the door. The legal wrapper stretches to fit reality. Title 10 and Title 50 complicate it further. Title 10 governs the armed forces, overt, accountable, chain of command clean. Title 50 covers intelligence activities and covert action with presidential findings and congressional notice. Most people think these are separate lanes. In practice, operations live in the scene. A military task force can request ISR from an intelligence element. An intelligence station can request movement support from a state PSD whose contract cites diplomatic security authorities. Contractors plug into both worlds as technicians, trainers, analysts, and protectors. Their status changes with the task order, the location, and the client, DoD, state, or an intel component. It's legal, but it's layered, and those layers blur when bullets fly. Accountability tries to keep up. Before Iraq, if a contractor committed a crime. The business of war, cost, capability, and capture. Follow the incentives, and you'll see why outsourcing sticks. Government buyers need surge capacity without permanent headcount. Contractors need predictable demand with flexible scope. The bridge is procurement math, vehicles that let agencies buy speed, scale, and deniability while keeping appropriators calm. Indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts set ceilings. Task orders move money quickly. Contingency clauses waive normal timelines. When risk spikes, the machine can add bodies, armor, radios, and aircraft in weeks, not budget cycles. Now, this is important because cost isn't just the invoice. Uniformed forces carry salaries, pensions, healthcare, training pipelines, and lifetime equipment sustainment. Contractors package those as a day rate plus overhead and profit. On paper, a guard with a rifle looks pricier than a sergeant. In full lifecycle accounting, the picture flips depending on duration. For 12 months in a hotspot, a contracted team can be cheaper and faster to field. For 10 years, the bill grows heavy, and institutional knowledge lives on vendor servers. The government buys time, but it also rents memory. Profit structures shape behavior. Cost-plus award fee reimburses actual costs and adds margin based on performance, encouraging rapid mobilization, but risking bloat if oversight is weak. Firm fixed price forces efficiency, but can tempt corner cutting if the threat picture intensifies midstream. Time and materials pays by the hour with a ceiling, good for uncertain scopes, but dependent on disciplined task management. Smart contracting officers calibrate metrics. On-time movement rates, incident frequency, training compliance, maintenance uptime, to reward outcomes that matter on the street, not slide decks. Capability is the other currency. Contractors sell a stack: vetted personnel, training academies, logistics tails, medical chains, intel cells, and aviation links. That stack is modular, needs static security at 5 compounds, spin up third country National Guards, supervised by a small US cadre, need high-threat movement, swap in top-tier drivers, gunners, TLs, and medics with rotation schedules, need surge ISR line. Add analysts, route reconnaissance, atmospherics, and local liaisons. The value is integration. Radios that talk to embassy nets, medevac that lands on military pads, reports that slot into government systems. Friction removed equals risk reduced. Capture risk creeps in alongside capability. Retired generals join boards, colonels advise business development, officials cycle through as consultants. None of that is automatically corrupt. Experience has value, but it tilts the field. Requirements can be written in a way only a few firms can meet. Proprietary radios, niche certifications, unusual past performance thresholds. That narrows competition, lifts prices, and locks agencies into renewals. The antidote is transparent evaluation, active red teaming of requirements, and breaking monoliths into competitive lots where possible. Training pipelines monetize credibility. Former SOF and Intel veterans become curriculum, selling the muscle memory of bad nights overseas. Courses mirror government standards: TCCC, defensive driving, surveillance detection, comms, cultural briefings. So insurers discount premiums and contracting officers tick boxes. A certification economy follows. Audits, qualifications, refreshers, and incident drills logged to the hour. The upside is professionalization. The downside is a barrier to entry that favors incumbents with capital and auditors on speed dial. Dependency is the shadow cost. When a mission leans on contractors for convoy movement, site security, maintenance, linguists, and aviation, commanders inherit a brittle point: labor relations and contract disputes. A peril delay can ground sorties. A visa snag can hollow a guard roster. A legal pause after an incident can freeze mobility. Uniformed units can surge to cover, but that carries political and budgetary implications. The very pressures outsourcing was meant to ease. The operational fix is redundancy: dual vendors, cross-trained staff, and government-owned fallback kits. The strategic fix is restraint. Don't outsource core competencies you can't rapidly reconstitute in-house. Insurance completes the loop. Underwriters reward firms with low incident rates, tight SOPs, and clean claims histories. Premiums fall when training hours rise, after-action reports are honest, and corrective actions are documented. That creates a feedback market. Better behavior gets cheaper money. It also enables quiet risk transfer. If a convoy crashes or a firefight goes wrong, liability moves through contracts, NDAs, and arbitration clauses. The story still matters, but the venue shifts from press conferences to conference rooms. Everything changes when speed meets oversight. The best programs embed government eyes inside contractor ops. Government technical monitors riding along, random kit inspections, SIMEX days where medevac, QRF, and air-ground comms get stress-tested. Performance data gets graphed, not glossed. Mean time between incidents, response times, medical outcomes, route denial decisions. When the numbers drift, fees drift with them. That's how you align incentives, without standing at every gate with a clipboard. But here's the paradox. The more contractors prove they can deliver capability fast, the more planners design around that assumption. Surge becomes standard. Temporary becomes persistent. Costs hide in supplemental appropriations and multiple award vehicles scattered across agencies. You win today's mission and mortgage tomorrow's flexibility. The capture isn't just firms influencing policy, it's policy becoming inseparable from firms. Now, does it work on the ground? Depends which ground. In stable chaos, countries where the flag must fly and roads are negotiable, the model hums. In full wars against adaptive enemies, the seams show. That's where incentives, accountability, and strategy have to be welded tight before the next crisis makes speed the only thing anyone cares about. Case studies: Angola to Iraq to Nigeria. Let's test the model in the wild. Start with Angola in the mid-1990s. Executive Outcomes arrives with a few hundred veterans, air support, and a simple mandate: break UNITA's momentum so the government can breathe. They don't try to hold Tehran like an army. They train a spearhead, fly Mi-24 gunships and Alouette gunships for shock, synchronize with ground maneuver, and within months flip key nodes: Sorimo, the diamond corridors. The result: negotiating leverage the Angolan government couldn't buy with UN resolutions. But here's the catch: success created reputational blowback. Western governments balked at a private outfit rewriting a civil war. Funding dried up, contracts lapsed, and the vacuum reopened. Tactical wins, strategic politics recall. Shift to Sierra Leone. EO repeats the formula: stop the RUF's advance, secure Freetown, reopen mines that pay salaries. With a small footprint and helicopters, they roll insurgents who had terrorized villages for years. Civilians cheer. Yet international pressure replaces EO with a weak peacekeeping posture, and the rebels surge back until a stronger external force arrives. The lesson isn't that PMCs can't stabilize. It's that battlefield gains without durable political architecture snap back. Policymakers watch closely. A small professional private force can buy time, But time has to be spent building a state, not just a ceasefire. Now take the Balkans and MPRI. Different playbook. No gunships, no raids. MPRI sells military education, doctrine reform, and staff training to Croatia, and later supports programs in Bosnia and Kosovo. The deliverable is competence, planning cycles, logistics, NCO development, interoperability. Critics argue it gave Zagreb the edge before Operation Storm. Defenders say it professionalized forces under constraints. Either way, Washington learned something useful. Training as policy can shape outcomes while preserving deniability. A contractor's classroom can move the needle without a brigade crossing a border. Fast forward to Iraq and the moment the model hits its limit. Nissa Square, 2007. A Blackwater conv, a chaotic scene, civilians killed. Whatever you think of the immediate facts, the strategic effect is clear. One tactical incident detonates international disgrace inside Iraq and political fire in Washington. Accountability mechanisms struggle. MEJA, US courts, host nation rage, and years of legal churn. The State Department's dependency on private PSD survives, but the rules of force tighten, vetting hardens, and oversight grows teeth. The open lesson: one contractor firefight can reset an entire theater's politics. The quieter lesson: the mission didn't pause. Movement still had to happen the next day, and the capacity still lived in contracts. Afghanistan shows the slow bleed of capacity building. DynCorp leads the police training portfolio under tough conditions. Illiteracy, corruption, shifting mission definitions, and a war where policing often looks like counterinsurgency. Metrics favored inputs, students trained, curricula delivered, facilities built, while the strategic metric that mattered, a legitimate, functional police force, lagged. Trainers rotated, lessons were relearned, and host nation ownership wobbled. Was it a failure of contractors? Partly. But it was also a design problem. You can't outsource legitimacy. You can rent instruction and logistics. You can't buy a social contract. Now slide offshore to the Gulf of Guinea. Nigeria's delta and the broader West African littoral offered a different test. Pirates, oil theft, sabotage, and floating production units sitting like ATM machines in bad neighborhoods. Maritime PMCs stitched together compliance with flag states, coastal state sensitivities, and insurance demands. The product wasn't gunfights on the high seas. It was layered deterrence, embarked security under local naval auspices, escort patterns, radar and AIS monitoring, embarked medics, and hardening on tankers. Insurers noticed. War risk premiums and K&R pricing bent down when operators showed credible security packages. The curve proved the point. Professionalization pays, and the market enforces discipline faster than memos. Here's a micro-story from West Africa. An FPSO operator faces repeated approach attempts at night. Crew anxiety spikes, insurers flag the route, production targets wobble. A contractor team audits lighting, installs thermal cameras, sets watch rotations, drills citadel procedures, and negotiates a MOU for naval escorts in the exclusion zone. Approaches continue, but the response geometry changes. Spot earlier, warn sooner, maneuver smarter. Losses don't vanish. They shrink to near misses and abandoned ladders. The broker logs the improvements. The premium falls at renewal. That's risk turned into a spreadsheet win. Across these cases, patterns harden. First, decisive capability can be delivered fast with small numbers when the mission is narrow, the client is aligned, and air mobility multiplies force. Second, reputational drag is real. EO's battlefield success triggered political antibodies. Blackwater's incident triggered legal and diplomatic antibodies. Third, training as policy is potent but fragile. MPRI worked when goals were coherent. DynCorp stumbled when goals were shifting and corruption ran ahead of curricula. Fourth, insurance and compliance steer behavior. In the Delta and on tankers, standards and audits made the difference between menace and manageable risk. But here's where it gets interesting for Washington's long game. Each case nudged the ecosystem toward permanence. Angola and Sierra Leone proved speed and effect. The Balkans normalized training as an instrument short of war. Iraq scaled protective mobility into an industrial process, ops rooms, route intel, medevac chains, and IDIQs spinning task orders weekly. Afghanistan exposed limits and forced a reckoning on what capacity means. The Gulf of Guinea expanded the model to maritime and energy, showing private security as a baseline cost of doing business, not a crisis add-on. Adversaries adapted too. Rebels learned to wait out contracts or attack legitimacy. Insurgents exploited row asymmetries and media narratives. Pirates probed for legal seams, territorial waters, flag state rules, and constraints on armed teams. That adaptation loop is why standards and integration matter. Firms with intel cells and real liaison outpaced threat changes. Firms without them were just steel and bravado. Each case pushes the system toward one conclusion: permanence. Not because private force is flawless, but because the alternative, shutting missions, surging uniforms, or accepting unmanaged risk, costs more in politics and money. That's the quiet legacy of 1979, playing out from Luanda to Baghdad to Bonny Island. Strategic consequences, policy by contractor. Here's the quiet shift no one voted on. Once contractors proved they could keep embassies open, move civilians through bad cities, and scale fast, they stopped being a contingency and became part of policy. The threshold for action dropped because the political cost curve flattened. If you can project presence without deploying a brigade, decisions tilt toward doing rather than waiting. That doesn't mean wars got easier. It means the entry ramp widened and the exit signs got smaller. Lower political cost shows up in headcounts and headlines. A president can avoid the optics of troop increases while expanding missions through task orders and option years. Losses hurt either way, but they register differently. Uniformed casualties trigger congressional roll calls and flags on the MAL. Contractor losses move through insurers, NDAs, and court filings months later. That asymmetry isn't a dodge. It's a design choice that shifts how risk is priced in Washington. When the visible cost of presence falls, policymakers ask for more presence. Metrics drift right behind it. Bureaucracies measure what contracts can count. On-time movements, sites secured, courses delivered, hours flown, incidents per mile. Those are useful, but they're not strategy. You can hit a 98% on-time rate and still lose a province. You can train 10,000 police and still miss legitimacy. When success becomes service delivery, mission creep hides in compliance dashboards. The map looks green, the ground stays grey. Partners feel the mixed message. A host government sees American badges at every gate, but fewer uniforms on parade grounds. Sovereignty gets touchy. Leaders appreciate protection and training, but citizens see private guns in convoys and ask who's in charge. Legitimacy erodes when the face of security is a contractor whose contract outlasts ministers. Quietly, some partners prefer it. Private teams show up, don't lecture, and keep schedules. Strategically, that can trade short-term stability for long-term dependency. Adversaries adapt faster than memos. If contractors carry different rules, insurgents probe those seams. They stage contact near markets to weaponize optics. They push lawfare, accusations, videos, court cases to tarnish protective teams and split coalitions. They build IED economies around predictable routes and target sets. Soft-skinned local guards 1 week, armored PSDs the next, logistics convoys after that. Drones and cheap ISR compress warning times. Proxy forces complicate attribution. The grey becomes the fight, not the backdrop. The net effect is a semi-privatized American presence. Not mercenaries replacing Marines, but a layered lattice. SOF for decisive tasks, conventional units for surge and deterrence, contractors for persistence and mobility, locals for mass and access. That lattice stretches across continents through embassies, consulates, forward sites, and partner compounds. It runs on contracts, insurance, visas, and flight plans as much as on orders. It is resilient to single shocks and vulnerable to slow rot, budget cliffs, visa bans, scandal cycles, and fatigue. Everything changes when this becomes normal. Procurement calendars steer policy tempo. Contract recompetes become policy reviews by proxy. A poor handoff between vendors can paralyze a mission more effectively than an enemy raid. Conversely, A well-run bridge contract can keep a fragile negotiation alive. The machine that moves people safely through hostile space starts to move policy itself. If the convoy can't roll, the deal can't close, the reform can't launch, the intelligence can't be validated. Logistics is strategy once the state chooses endurance over exit, and that quiet dependency is exactly what adversaries try to exploit. Inside Washington, incentives split. Operators want reliability and speed. Lawyers want tight liability lanes. Budgeteers want flexible accounts with minimal headlines. Oversight wants clean audits and few surprises. Contractors live at that crossroads, shaping requirements through performance data and post-award realities. That's where capture risk lives, not in cartoon corruption, but in path dependence. If only 3 firms can meet the standards written from yesterday's lessons, tomorrow's options narrow before the debate starts. There's a human cost that spreadsheets miss. Rotations grind. Third country guards stand long posts under heat for modest pay. American supervisors carry legal exposure across languages, ministries, and alleys where one wrong turn becomes a video. They deliver mostly because training, standards, and insurance push professionalism. But when things go wrong, accountability is uneven. MEJA cases crawl, host nation courts swing political, arbitration gags details. The shadow of accountability lingers, never quite catching up to the speed of contracting. Now, this is important because strategic discipline has to live above the contract line. Decide where private force enables policy and where it quietly defines it. Map missions that truly require uniformed authority, deterrence, coercion, stabilization, and protect those from outsourcing creep. Use contractors where their edge is real. Mobility for civilians, surge protection, technical depth, but tie their metrics to strategic outcomes, not just delivery. Require joint rehearsals for blended teams, shared comms plans, and medevac agreements that treat badges as irrelevant when bleeding starts. Partner perceptions can be managed with transparency. Co-badge programs, host nation liaison inside ops rooms, and clear grievance channels reduce sovereignty friction. Adversary adaptation can be blunted with intelligence fusion that treats contractor routes as operational priorities, not admin. Insurance can be harnessed. Premium discounts for threat-informed routing, rest cycles, and driver training aligned with incident curves. And the politics, accept the trade. Deniability lowers the threshold to act, so guard the threshold with policy, not optics. If presence is cheap, use it sparingly. If contractors make endurance possible, decide what the endurance is for. The machine you built to avoid another Tehran can keep you out of traps or keep you circling them forever. The 1979 Doctrine, never be trapped again. Here's the doctrine that formed in the shadows after Tehran. Never be trapped on camera, never bet the presidency on one visible move, and always keep a deniable option within reach. It wasn't written as a memo. It seeped into budgets, training, contracting, and the way Washington thought about embassies, movement, and hostages. If Eagle Claw showed how a single failure can scar strategy, the response baked a rule into the system. Spread risk across layers you can rearrange fast. Start with optics. Tehran proved that a hostage crisis isn't just a crime, it's a theater. The new rule was simple: avoid scenarios where Americans are immobile, surrounded, and televised. That meant new movement doctrine for diplomats, different thresholds for evacuations, and a bias toward hardening compounds that could ride out sieges without daily headlines. If you must stay, you must maneuver. If you must maneuver, you need protection that doesn't drag divisions into view. Next came the layers. Uniforms up front for sovereign tasks, deterrence, assault, last-ditch defense. Special operations as the scalpel, fast, disciplined, and integrated under SOCOM. Contractors as the connective tissue, static security, conv, protection, aviation, intel support, able to surge, rotate, and absorb visibility. Local forces as mass, access, language, and legitimacy when it's there. Each ring carried different legal authorities, insurance, and political exposure. Together, they formed a system that could flex when a street turned, a minister fell, or a network shifted. Now, this is important because the doctrine wasn't about avoiding risk. It was about refracting it. Legal exposure moved through contracts and host nation laws. Political exposure shifted from uniforms to badges. Financial exposure traveled into insurance and liability clauses. The state kept control of strategy while pushing tactical friction into spaces that could bend without breaking cabinets or coalitions. Most people think that's cynicism. It's actually survival, learned the hard way from a camera on a gate. Keeping embassies open became a principle, not a preference. Close a post, and you lose sources, leverage, and the ability to influence allies facing the same threats. The doctrine demanded hardened walls, secure comms, redundant power, and mobility that didn't depend on a brigade. That mobility lived in PSDs with rehearsed drills, air bridges for worse days, and intel cells that treated a consul's car like a patrol. If roads went red, routes changed. If cities locked down, flights found gaps. Presence without movement is a target. Movement without intelligence is a gamble. The doctrine married both. Deniability wasn't a trick, it was a buffer. A protective detail operating under state contract with clear rules can take a hit without turning into a diplomatic crisis every time. A contractor aviation lift can land on an improvised strip to pull out a team without painting a carrier number across a headline. The point wasn't to hide the United States. It was to keep options alive until strategy caught up. Tehran taught that once you're trapped, politics takes your playbook away. The intelligence fix was part of it. Lose human and you fly blind. The doctrine pushed for blended collection, formal liaison, private atmospherics, commercial data, and SOF reconnaissance when warranted. Contractors often sat in the grey, surveying routes, mapping choke points, and feeding insights that insurance and ops teams both valued. You can see the convergence. The same standards that satisfied underwriters also made operations safer. The market enforced the doctrine's discipline. Here's a micro-story that shows the rule in motion. A consulate faces rising abduction attempts. Instead of shutting down, the team rebuilds movement, randomized departure windows, decoy convoys, air inserts to cut the deadliest mile, and embedded medics with practiced Kazovac. A local partner adds outering patrols near markets. An analyst correlates social media spikes with route closures. The post stays open, the risk bends. That's never be trapped, applied at street level. Spread the risk became spread the burden. Legal teams wrote contracts that made standards enforceable. Procurement set measurable performance. SOCOM drilled joint rescue options that didn't rely on miracles. State synchronized watch floors with contractor ops rooms. Partners were cultivated to host training sites and provide liaison. And when the worst happened, the system could absorb shock, investigations, corrections, and continued presence without replaying 1979. Tehran's legacy, stripped of drama, is a doctrine of layered resilience. Avoid hostage optics. Keep embassies open with hardening and mobility. Use SOF for decisive moments, contractors for persistence, locals for depth. Move liability where it can be managed. Move quickly, but not loudly. And always keep an exit that isn't a press conference. One hinge year remains the pivot point. Counter-arguments and real limits. Let's pressure test the model. First, the money claim. PMCs save money. Sometimes. Short deployments and surge tasks look cheaper than adding billets, pensions, and gear. But hidden lifecycle costs creep in. Proposal churn, mobilization premiums, danger pay, armored fleet sustainment, and layered management overhead. Add training pipelines, contract transitions, audits, and MEJA compliance, and the savings can evaporate. Oversight gaps turn into rework bills. The fix is blunt. Total cost accounting over the mission's real horizon, not a fiscal year. Professionalism varies. Top-tier firms recruit seasoned veterans, certify relentlessly, and embed medics and analysts. Others cut corners, rely on thin supervision, or push third-country nationals into roles beyond their training. That variance creates uneven outcomes on the same street. Standards help. TCCC hours, driving quals, row refreshers, stress shoots. But standards only bite when clients enforce them with ride-alongs, surprise validations, and fiat-risk clauses tied to performance data, not glossy binders. Accountability is friction, not fiction. MEJA extends US jurisdiction. The UCMJ can reach certain categories. Host nation law applies where SOFAs don't. In practice, cases are slow, evidence is messy, and politics collides with procedure. Arbitration clauses and NDAs shift disputes off stage, which protects investigations but fuels suspicion. The only way through is sunlight with discipline. Public reporting on incident rates and corrective actions, unclassified row summaries for host nations, and credible pathways for grievances that don't require a minister's intervention. Strategic myopia is the quiet killer. Contractors solve tactical problems fast, which tempts leaders to confuse movement with momentum. You can move every principle on time and still lose the district. You can train battalions and still miss the power network that governs promotions. When contracts define success, strategy drifts toward what's measurable. Countering that requires command intent baked into performance metrics. Tie bonuses to enabling political milestones, partner capability milestones, root denial decisions that preserve legitimacy, not just conf counts. There are missions where uniformed control isn't optional, it's essential. Coercion, deterrence, and stabilization under fire demand authorities, discipline, and escalation control that only the chain of command brings. Partner force vetting at scale, disarmament programs, and population security belong to the flag, not a contract. Even within protection, certain nodes, airfields, joint ops centers, high-risk prisoner moves, are better held by uniformed units to signal sovereignty and control. Legal seams can become traps. Title 10 and Title 50 interfaces work until a firefight blurs them. If a protective detail supports an intel movement and contact escalates, who commands, whose row governs, and which reporting chain owns the aftermath? Without pre-briefed authorities, shared comms, and joint deconfliction, tactical seconds turn into strategic hours. The real fix is rehearsal. Blended SIMEX that forces badges and uniforms to solve the same, injects under one radio plan. Dependency is a limit. If your mobility, site security, maintenance, and linguists all sit on contracts, a visa hiccup, labor strike, or legal pause freezes operations. Dual-source critical functions, pre-clear government fallback kits, cross-train staff, and keep a small uniformed quick reaction bench warm for essential nodes. Don't outsource what you can't surge back in 72 hours. Optics cut both ways. Private guns reduce troop headlines, but they can sharpen sovereignty questions. Host publics read convoys differently, politicians amplify incidents, and adversaries push lawfare. Co-badging, host nation liaison embedded in ops rooms, and transparent incident processes reduce the fuel. So does hiring deep local where trust allows, with US supervision focused on standards and escalation. Last, the ethics. Markets reward delivery, not restraint. Good firms self-limit, bad ones chase scope. Clients must draw lines. No offensive tasks masked as protection, no detention authorities via site control, no intelligence collection beyond contract terms. Write the red lines, audit them, and tie award fees to staying inside them. So what should decision makers do with this? Use contractors as a tool, not a crutch. Price the full mission, enforce standards you can verify, integrate legally before contact, and reserve inherently governmental functions for the flag. When the model stays inside those rails, it reduces traps. Outside them, it builds new ones. What comes next? AI, drones, and the next outsourcing wave. Everything we just mapped sets the stage for the next pivot. Security that's partly human, partly software, and often remote. The core need hasn't changed. Keep people moving, keep posts open, avoid hostage optics. But the tools are shifting to autonomy, sensors, and services you can buy like cloud storage. Start with autonomy. ISR as a service is no longer a slide. It's a vendor category. Small contractors already field drone stacks that combine fixed-wing endurance birds for perimeter overwatch, quadcopters for close escort, and tethered aerostats for persistent eyes. The product isn't the airframe, it's the feed, stabilized video, change detection, route analytics, and automated alerts pushed to a convoy commander's tablet. Add ground robots as point men for alleys and culverts, and you get standoff recon, that lowers the chance your TL rounds a blind corner into an ambush. Now, this is important because autonomy changes the staffing math. A PSD that once needed 12 shooters for 2 vehicles might run with 8 and a drone cell, 2 operators managing overwatch, mapping spontaneous roadblocks, and spotting tail cars through traffic with air-assisted identification. Counter-UAS becomes part of every loadout. Handheld detectors, protocol-based jammers, and tactics to defeat FPV drones at intersections. Contractors will sell these as bundles, escort plus ISR plus counter-UAS, billed by day, by route, or even by gigabytes processed. Drone PSD sounds futuristic until you realize it mirrors what aviation already did for years: bypass the worst roads. Only now the air isn't just a helicopter, it's a mesh of cheap platforms pushing data to cheap screens. Insurers will notice. Expect premiums to reward operators who log flight hours, record detections, and prove they've reduced near-miss rates on red routes. Data becomes the new training log, evidence that you saw the threat first and moved differently. Cyber is the second front of outsourcing. The same firms that harden compounds are adding digital guardrails, endpoint monitoring on field laptops, phishing drills for local guards, and dark web sweeps for kidnap chatter and docs travel plans. Influence ops bleed into route safety. A rumor cascading on local social platforms can pull crowds into a choke point faster than any IED network. Contractors will staff InfoSec escorts, analysts who watch sentiment spikes and flip routes when a narrative turns flammable. You'll see tender language pair protective security with protective intelligence and digital risk, priced per seat per month. Here's where it gets interesting. Insurance will underwrite this too. Policies that once asked for armored SUVs will ask for MFA, endpoint protection, and disinformation playbooks. A breach that exposes travel manifests becomes a kidnap catalyst. Underwriters will demand controls the way they demanded blast film after Beirut. Firms that can certify cyber hygiene alongside route discipline will win bids and pay less for coverage. Regulation lags, then snaps forward. ITAR and AECA already govern exports of hardware and tech. Expect services to feel tighter controls. Selling drone ISR in a fragile state looks like exporting a capability, not renting a camera. Licensing will follow, with carve-outs for humanitarian movements and diplomatic support. Contractors will build compliance teams that look like defense primes, end-user monitoring, tech control plans, and auditable logs for every firmware update. The firms that scale will be the ones that treat regulation as a feature, not a nuisance. Profit models will evolve. Instead of pure day rates, you'll see subscription tiers for protective intelligence, usage fees for drone sorties, and surge pricing for crisis weeks. IDIQs will add data deliverables, threat heat maps, route risk scores, anomaly logs, tied to award fees. Governments will demand data escrow, so intelligence isn't trapped in vendor silos. Smart clients will require interoperability. Threat feeds in SDIX TAXII, video in open formats, and APIs that pump alerts into Embassy watch floors without a contractor middleman. The labor mix changes with the tools. You still need seasoned TLs, drivers, and medics, but you add UAS pilots, geotechs, data analysts, and field cyber hands who can sanitize a principal's phone on the tarmac. Training shifts. TCCC remains non-negotiable, but now you add counter-drone drills, sensor discipline, and rapid exploit of incident video for debrief and claims. The best teams will treat drones and data as force multipliers, not crutches. Eyes that keep people alive rather than screens that slow decisions. There's a new Tehran risk, hostage-taking in the infosphere. If adversaries can't take your people, they'll take your data. Live tracking convoys via leaked manifests, scraping staff profiles, spoofing clearances, and blackmailing with deepfakes. Contractors will respond with identity shields, comms hardening, and deepfake drills. Code words, challenge responses, and visual TTPs that verify principles under duress. Expect insurance riders for data-enabled kidnap, pricing the delta between organizations that can spot synthetic audio and those that can't. Adversaries won't sit still. Cheap FPV drones will hunt soft convoys. AI will sift traffic cams for route patterns. Spoofed SOS calls will lure QRFs into traps. The counter is integration. Radio plans that fail safe. Drone nets that fuse feeds from multiple vendors, and row updated for UAS threats in urban canyons. Policymakers must set guardrails now. No autonomous lethal effects under protective contracts, mandatory human-in-the-loop for escalation, and shared audit trails for every electronic trigger pulled. The upside is real. Autonomy and data can cut casualties, raise detection, and shrink the window between warning and action. The hazard is drift. If remote capability makes presence feel cheap again, the threshold problem returns. More missions, longer tails, strategic aims still fuzzy. The discipline remains the same as 1979's lesson. Use layers to avoid traps, but don't let layers replace strategy. One number brought us here. It still matters because it encodes the rule. Never be trapped, on camera, on a road, or in a data stream. The next outsourcing wave will test whether we learned it. The single takeaway: 444 days taught Washington to spread risk through deniable, layered security, now upgraded with drones, data, and quiet reach. If you want the full picture of how private militaries evolved from Angola to Iraq, watch the next deep dive linked here and subscribe for more hidden consequences. Drop a comment. Did PMCs improve security or just shift the costs?